So hello, BookTube. I probably titled this video something ridiculous like nobody reads nonfiction on BookTube, and we all know that's nonsense. So this is the nonfiction on BookTube tag. This was created by Olive at a book Olive. And the first question is, how much nonfiction do you read? I'm doing this tag so that I can give you a general overview of my nonfiction reading, but to give you a pure number would be nebulous because some nonfiction is intended to be read cover to cover and some is not. So my recipe books, for example, I work with periodically over long stretches of time. Things like I'm a practicing lawyer, so I read a lot of law, but it's always very highly tailored and specific to the issue that I'm working with at the time. So, how much nonfiction? Maybe 80 to 90% of my reading is nonfiction just because that's what I enjoy, and it tends to be split into subcategories. So, things like I love psychology and self development, but if it's written in the second person, I'm generally not interested because everyone's lived experience is so highly specific, and it's so highly unique to them that I think this one size fits all kind of advice I don't find helpful. So when the book owns its specificity, when it's a memoir, biography, autobiography, I quite love that because again, then we go into the details of that person's life, and I just find that a lot more useful. So psychology, self-development, I've read things like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, things like No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz, anything by Pete Walker I very much enjoy. There's a memoir called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Laurie Gottlieb, and that's about her experience as a therapist. So initially she works for a television network and then she works on a medical show, and she thinks, oh, I really love these medical dramas, and she spent so much time with the doctors that were doing the fact checking for the show, and one of them said to her, maybe this is your passion, maybe you should attend medical school. And she does, and she finds out it's not for her because of the insurances and the fact that you can't have a long-term relationship with your patient, and eventually that's what makes her think of pivoting into psychology. Initially she thinks of psychiatry, but a faculty member within the university said to her, look, psychiatry is very much in the same direction, so psychology would fit for you. And when she attends therapy in her own right, she just thinks, ah, I know everything. I'm a therapist myself. She's very embarrassed to ask her therapist friends for a referral. She just says no, like asking for a friend. And yeah, and then she thinks, no, I'm going to be fixed in 3 sessions. And in her first session, she just cries. And afterwards, she comes out thinking, that was such an expensive cry. I paid for a full therapy session and nothing happened. So it's a very funny book from her perspective. And I love the specificity of her lived experience. I've also switched careers, and yeah, there's a lot in her book that I could relate to and enjoy if I didn't relate to. So yeah, so psychology. I read a lot of Buddhism, but again, I see this growing genre of like self-help, psychology, Buddhism, like this mash of like Buddhism for dummies, which is written from the second person and is telling you this is how you must meditate, and this. I don't mean to be disparaging of it. It's just that that's not what I read. I prefer to look more specifically into what's it like to be a nun within the Zen tradition, within the Theravadan tradition. What's it like to practice Tibetan Buddhism but to have lost certain aspects of it because of Chinese occupation and interference? The position of the Dalai Lama, looking at the decline of that position and how maybe the Tibetan people will let go of that tradition completely. I think we're on the 14th Dalai Lama or whatever it is right now. And I just find those things really interesting. I think stuff like religion and art, it's never pure and uninterfered with. There's always aspects of cultural clashes, geopolitics, those kinds of issues. So I really love reading correspondences from artists, so like the letters of Vincent van Gogh, and seeing how the external circumstances have shaped their art. So, for example, people like Rembrandt, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, obviously there wasn't much of a separation between church and state, and so that influenced their art. You would have kings coming and saying, you need to make me look like I was biblically ordained to rule XYZ country. And that country was probably occupied and colonized and whatever it is, and its borders no longer exist anymore. Italy was under Austrian occupation for a very long period of time. So I just find this to be fascinating and topical because today people are losing their shit over AI, and they're talking about brain rot, and they're like, yeah, technology, it's unfounded, it's never happened before. People have been talking about this since Plato and Socrates. When the printing press was invented, people were losing their shit. oh my God, people will never memorize things ever again. Oh no, people are reading too much. So I just think, yes, you can have your issues with AI and technology and everything. Um, but again, this is not exactly unprecedented. I think reading about this kind of thing gives you perspective. I don't know. This is my problem. I just rant and I just go on tangents. So, question two, what kind of nonfiction videos do you make or do you want to make on BookTube? Now, the thing is, I will take direction from you. What sounds interesting to you? Because I don't know. Question three is, what is your favorite subgenre of nonfiction? So as I've talked a little bit about psychology, I've talked a bit about the Buddhism that I read. My law reading, I don't read purely about the legislation and how the legislation developed and those kinds of things, purely law. So when people do their honors thesis in their LLB in South Africa, it tends to be only doctrinal research, so black letter. So you only look at the legislation, you look at the law, you look at its development. Great, wonderful, there is a place for that. But I think, so I have experience within private law. That's wills and estates, conveyancing, family law. Everybody is interested in to hear about the divorces and all of the messy things that ensue. General litigation, commercial litigation, leases, evictions, debt collection. Like I've done a lot of that, but my interest specifically is in human rights law and public interest law. Now the thing is, I do have an interest in environmentalism. I've got my veggie garden. Veganism is something that I practice, but that's still very on an individual scale, and I would love to scale it up and have a more systemic impact and a more policy impact with environmental law. But in South Africa, environmental law tends to be tied in with a lot of other aspects. So human rights law is very dynamic, and you need to just keep in touch with what exactly are the issues and how can you as a legal practitioner adapt to that. So I read a lot of journalism, and of course journalism can be in like your newspapers, your headlines, your very standalone stories. But there are journalists within South Africa that write about long-running issues. Maybe they've covered issues for long periods of time. Something like Mandy, Wiener, she wrote a book called The Whistleblowers, and this was a series of interviews with various whistleblowers in the public sector, in the private sector, in various kinds of organizations, smaller organizations, larger organizations. The book did say that it was going to talk about legislative reform and some of her suggestions for legislative reform, but I personally did not really detect any of that within the book. Maybe there's something that I missed, I don't know. There's people like Jonathan Jansen, where he's worked in education for many years, and so from that he writes books. It's a series of essays and critiques and opinion pieces about education and the direction that it's moving in. So he specifically wrote about issues like decolonization, things like funding and all sorts of things. So again, I follow those kinds of things. I do enjoy reading the books cover to cover about specific long-running issues. However, the more cutting edge, maybe human rights law issues, you don't necessarily see like books about it. So kind of the refugee experience and the migrant experience within South Africa, that's something that I'm very interested in. I've specifically learned French for that. I'm now very shortly going into a position where I will be using my French. I will be in a human rights law position. I'm very nervous, honestly. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do. It's just that I want to do justice to my clients. And about the refugee experience, just on that topic, I went to the National Arts Festival in 2024, and there was theatre in the round. So the audience was sitting around the actors, and it was so fantastic. So I need to find the name of the theatre, but they did a series of interviews of migrant women in conjunction with UKZN, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and it was these oral histories and testimonies about the migrant experience. And then I think these monkeys, I think I need to just excuse me for a minute. Okay, that was a false alarm. Sometimes the monkeys get in through Bella's dog flap and then they steal our vegetables. Yeah, like oral testimonies in UKZN, and so from there they created a script and they made a play. But again, in terms of books, you don't necessarily find so many books about the refugee experience in South Africa. So again, my reading is scattered, it's all over the place. It can be academic journals, not necessarily just books. So my favorite subgenre of nonfiction, that's very difficult to answer. Do you have a favorite nonfiction book? I'll just say Agent 401 by Olivia Forsyth, I think is the name of it. It's on my bookshelf somewhere. And it's about this ordinary person who gets pulled into being a spy for the apartheid regime. What the hell? Like, it actually happened. I just think that is absolutely fascinating. So yeah, that book is fascinating, but I also really love, so for a more contemporary example, What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu, and it talks about living with complex PTSD as a result of just severe child abuse. And she specifically wrote that to shift the narrative that, see, PTSD, you're just going to suffer forever and that's it. Her story was a lot more hopeful, and I really did take a lot from that. I thought it was wonderful. She talks about obviously that abuse and the estrangement, and I think there was an Oprah episode recently about how estrangement is a trend from the younger generation, and that's so depressing. I mean, if you as an audience member don't understand what would lead to estrangement, then I think just I'm happy for you that you don't understand how severe things can be to lead to estrangement. So question 5 is, what do you think keeps people from wanting to read more nonfiction? That I don't know. I You tell me, what do you think? Question 6 is, why do you like nonfiction? Okay, so as a child, I loved reading, and it would be a little bit in between both. So it would be fiction, it would be nonfiction. And the nonfiction that I read more as a kid was maybe biology, and like marine biology, microbiology, that kind of thing. So about animals and the environment. I'm still very interested in environmentalism, recycling, these kinds of things, but I've sort of zoomed out. So I think as a child and as a 10-year-old, you want to believe that no, if you just recycle your bottles and if you clean everything will be fine. The ozone layer will rebuild itself, and you read your National Geographic and National Geographic Kids. But as I've gotten older, I've obviously seen it's so much more than that. There's so much in terms of sociology, overconsumption, businesses, economics, how that feeds into environmentalism, and how a lot of things are very much connected. I forgot what was the question. Oh, why do you like nonfiction? Okay. So I think I like nonfiction because I'm just very curious about the world around me. And I think you can very much scratch that itch with fiction as well. So when it says, what do you think keeps people from reading nonfiction? If you are curious about the world and you are happy with fiction, I don't think there's any problem with that. I don't think you should or you have to be reading nonfiction. It's just that for me, fiction, I find, is, and it is changing, but it's very centered on a very white Western US UK kind of experience, and the voices of us from the global south, people of color, that's not as represented, certainly not through my childhood years, teenage years, maybe early 20s, and that's quite a chunk of my reading life. And so I just thought, okay, I can get that through nonfiction rather, because nonfiction is highly specific in a way that I find useful. When it's just white woman from the US is sad, I don't have as much utility within that. I don't enjoy it as much. I can't get deeply into the story as much and feel like I'm gaining quite as much. Whereas now I see with, for example, the Women's Prize for Fiction, the Man Booker International, the Man Booker itself, you definitely get a lot more diversity of voices, certainly than what I was exposed to when I was growing up. And remember, I was using public libraries where the books were generally outdated, my school libraries as well. We got what we could get. But nowadays, my mother-in-law is a school librarian, and as she says, we really need a lot more isiZulu books. We need books in the indigenous languages. She's got friends who write children's books, for South African kids. So they write about indigenous South African birds from the perspective of a house cat and a house dog, domestic pets. So the dog and the cat are sister and brother, and they are observing the birds and what the birds sound like. And the illustrations as well in the book are beautiful. And I think kids need that. Kids need to see their own lived experience reflected back to them, at least to some extent. We need the lived experiences of autistic people, people with disabilities, people with ADHD. My fiance has ADD, and I think seeing that in literature is very important. So I think, to answer this question, why do you like nonfiction? One, because I'm curious, and two, because fiction did not have enough representation to satisfy my curiosity, and so I had to go to nonfiction. It's actually quite a bit of a sad answer. Question 7. What's a nonfiction book that you read because of BookTube? To be perfectly honest with you, I don't know that I found anybody on BookTube that aligns with my nonfiction taste, and anybody that, interested me. So, things like psychology, the book recommendations that I get from there, I generally go onto Reddit and go onto CPTSD Reddit. And my Buddhism is, again, quite highly specialized and incomprehensible to most people, so I don't really go onto BookTube, to be perfectly honest with you, for that. Question 8 is, what is the best nonfiction book that you've read lately? Okay, so I haven't completed it, but it's Memories, Dreams, Reflections by Carl Jung. And I was just very curious about his concept of the anima, the animus, the shadow self, all of these kinds of things. So I was really interested in his lived experience. It's very mystical. So, so he almost writes a little bit like Marcel Proust. And because I'm doing this shadow growth journal workbook, just so that you can see it a little bit better here, and it was talking about the anima and the animus, and I was not really understanding what that is, and I thought, as much as I can Google and it'll give you that AI stupid thing, but I thought I'd like to hear about it from Carl Jung himself. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how he came to be. So Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I haven't finished it, but I really am enjoying that. Maybe the best nonfiction book that I've read lately, I suppose. So question 9 is, what are some of your nonfiction reading goals? And I don't have goals. I just do. I just read. I just follow my curiosity. I have a lot of drive, a lot of discipline, a lot of curiosity. So it's like there's a fire under my bum all the time. I don't really need those external metrics. My fiance, for example, is very type B. He loves his afternoon naps whenever he can get them. He's very leisurely. So he says sometimes he does need a bit of a kick in the bum, but I am not that person. I need to be like pushed into bed and told to lie down, and then you have to close my eyes so that I will rest. I have a lot of drive and ambition, so again, I don't necessarily need metrics. Question 10 is, what is your advice for incorporating more nonfiction into your reading diet? As I said, my specific reason for approaching nonfiction is because I was not satisfied with fiction, and I think if you are satisfied with fiction, there is nothing wrong with that, and that's wonderful. So, but if you'd like to look at more nonfiction within your reading diet, what are you drawn to in fiction? Are you drawn to romance and the inner worlds of the characters and the dynamics and the conflict? Maybe you'd like to learn from the Gottman Institute, and you'd like to learn about attachment styles and love languages, and Gary Chapman is a little bit problematic with the love languages and all that, but maybe you'd like Esther Perel. I put my whole chest behind Esther Perel. I think she's fantastic. So, is it those relational dynamics that are interesting you? Maybe you'd like psychology. Do you tend to read historical fiction, and do you gravitate towards the Edwardian era? Maybe then read about the Edwardian era. I love the Edwardian era. I think it's fantastic. Again, what are your interests? And then, what are your interests in fiction? And then go from there. If you don't even want to look at your reading, then do you enjoy visual art? Do you enjoy painting and oil pastels and oil painting? You can read some nonfiction about those techniques. If you don't want to get so technical, you can read about some oil painters that you like. What influenced their style to be like that? You can read sort of biographies about artists and things like that. My fiance loves like driving and Top Gear and those kinds of things, and so obviously he doesn't really read. He's the son of a school librarian, but he doesn't read. Anyway, and then just the last question is, as a bonus, recommend some nonfiction BookTube channels that you love. Now, I think if you want to get into nonfiction, you don't only have to look into BookTube. I specifically love Heidi Priebe, and she talks about attachment styles, healing that, conflict dynamics within relationships. And obviously, you can apply this to something like romantic relationships, but also friendships, also your workplace. I would consider her maybe BookTube in a very broad sense, because it is based on literature. Everything that she says is based on literature. Forrest Hansen as well does the Being Well podcast, and so again he talks about psychology, but it has a very strong basis in literature as well. Those are just two off the top of my head, and that is the end of the tag. So bye, BookTube.